So, welcome back, listeners, to Radio Gagan. It's been a while since our last episode. Lots been happening. So, obviously, I'm here with Gagan Mahindra, the MP of South West Hertfordshire. So, Gagan, how was your recent recess? I understand you went on a trip.
Gabriel, thank you for firstly having me. Yes, during the most recent recess, I was able to go over to the other side of the world, to the Falklands. Cool. As part of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme to see our military presence over in that part of the world in South America. It's a really, really long way. I can attest to that. But actually, while we were there for 5-6 days, it was a really interesting trip. And with the melting of the polar caps, the Antarctic is going to be even more of an important strategic thing for things like shipping. So actually our presence there in the medium term will definitely be in our benefit.
Yeah, great. And did you see any penguins? They're famous for their penguins.
We did. We did have a lot of serious meetings, speaking to the boys and girls that ensure security for the islands. We were able to take a morning off just to go and see some penguins. When we got to the beach where the penguins were meant to be, we got out of our vehicles, walked across effectively a bit of a hill to get to the beach, and we saw a lone penguin.
Oh.
And so we, obviously, a bunch of tourists went running to have a closer look. Obviously, the little penguin was a bit concerned, given how close the humans were trying to get. So we let that particular penguin go, but there was meant to be a penguin colony a bit further down. So we ended up walking what felt like miles, well, probably only about a mile, along the beach. And lo and behold, there was, I don't know what the
whole colony.
Is it a colony? A whole colony of penguins.
I think it's a flock, but
no, they're really, really cute, actually, in real life. So
excellent. And I had the pleasure the other day, I think it was 3rd of February, of attending the town hall that we organised in Abbots Langley to meet sort of some of the new wards that are coming into the new patch. How do you prepare for an event like that? You're obviously thinking on your feet, you're getting questions. The questions aren't given to you in advance at all.
No, so I think one of the skills I've picked up in 20 years of elected office is actually just listening. And I know that I'm never the smartest person in the room, but I don't need to be. It's actually, how do I translate the question into a way that I can add value and help? So I spend a lot of my day job actually signposting people to the right people. So I'm a networker, is the way I crudely describe it. So when someone comes to me with a problem, person A, I try and figure out which person B can I introduce them to or send them to actually find a solution to their issue. So it's very much thinking on your feet, but I think any politician at this level has that ability, because I don't think we would have passed the hustings and the selection process to get to this level if we hadn't.
Yeah, great. And what do you think about towards the end of last year, the government announced that you're setting the ambitious goal of creating a smoke-free generation. So I think there's a whole host of encouraging certain, vaping strategies to get people off smoking. But what do you think about this new goal? And especially nobody, I think after 2009, being able to buy cigarettes?
So Gabriel, you're chucking me a curveball there, because some of my family may be aware that I used to smoke. And there may be others who are not, so apologies in advance and sorry for taking up the habit. But I smoked for many years. I gave up several years ago now. And actually one of my biggest regrets is actually starting to start smoking. Because at the time I thought it was a bit of a social icebreaker where you could interact with people, just saying, actually, do you have light and things like that. One of the proudest things I'm able to do as a Member of Parliament is actually go and speak to school kids and say how lucky they are to be brought up in this country and have the opportunities that I was lucky enough to benefit from. But when I speak to teachers of primary school and secondary school, one of the highest concerns they have is things like vaping. Now, I'm a libertarian, free marketeer, and I want to give people the freedom of choice, but when you've got things like vapes being purposely targeted at young children, that's not the reason why vapes should be endorsed. So if you're looking to give up tobacco and cigarettes and cigars and what have you, yes, it's actually a stepping stone to stopping smoking. But if the first time you're actually getting involved in nicotine is a vape, there's a failure in the system, and that's why there'll be a free vote, and the Prime Minister's announced that there'll be a free vote in the future. But in my head, I'm still internally arguing the cases for both sides to say actually what is the appropriate measures required to ensure that children of today have a healthier and better lifestyle than previous generations. Yeah, and
it's been going around. It's been sort of some have seen it as a bit controversial, but perhaps not as controversial. I don't know if you saw last month, but General Sir Patrick Sanders announced that said in a hypothetical war with Russia, the UK might have to introduce conscription. It sort of created a bit of a media firestorm around it. But lots of countries in Europe, sort of Switzerland, Greece, Austria, and I think newly Latvia have reinstated conscription. What are your thoughts on the idea of conscription?
So I think the head of the armed forces has actually called in the head of the army on those comments, and in some ways given a bit of a public dressing down. I didn't join the CCF. I was never. I was too busy doing sports, but I know that some of my friends and family actually did do the CCF, and actually for a teenager doing that sort of structured exercise and activity in some cases is actually beneficial. So I'm not against conscription, but I do think it shouldn't just be related to military activity, because some people have personal views about supporting the armed forces, and it could actually just be in things like getting engaged in blue light services or charity. So in some ways encouraging people to give back to the community. Yes, the first priority of any government is defence of the realm, but that could be articulated in different ways rather than just putting on a uniform. Yeah.
And sort of on the topic of sort of Russia and obviously recently the very sad news of the death of Alexei Navalny. What do you think are a chief thing that politicians such as yourself or your colleagues can learn from his life and his dealings in Russian politics?
So just on that, I've literally just come back from the Speaker's residence, where we've got the Swedish Speaker as a guest, and he's brought a delegation from Sweden who are obviously in the process of joining NATO. As listeners will hopefully know, I've got Northwood NATO base in my constituency. I'm a proud and passionate advocate for NATO. I think what we've learned from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's just over 2 years now, is that actually statecraft is really important, and you can't take your foot off the pedal. So I would argue what we've seen from Putin's aggressive nature has been a failure of statecraft over many decades, and Russia's not the only country in the world that looks to us to see actually is there moments of weakness that they can exploit. So we need to get better, and actually having someone of the calibre of Lord Cameron back as Foreign Secretary, I think is a good thing. So I'm a massive fan of my previous boss, the former Foreign Secretary. But when you've got someone like Lord Cameron, who's former Prime Minister, going around the world and talking about UK PLC, a lot of the world leaders listen to him because he's been around a long time and he knows them personally. We cannot take peace for granted. I was of a generation where the Cold War was nearing the end. We've had many decades of peace, and someone of your own age, Gabriel, and you're also a little younger than me. The reality is we're more likely to see conflict than not. And it requires people at my level, parliamentarians, not just in the United Kingdom but around the world, to actually defend our values, and it's having a big stick and occasionally needing to use it. So Ukrainian is at the front line of that, and our support for Ukraine, I think, is paramount and needs to be maintained, and the Prime Minister echoed that thought earlier at PMQs today, and I'm fully behind him on that.
Excellent. And last Wednesday, the 21st of Feb, there was some disgruntlement, to put it mildly, in the House of Commons surrounding the SNP's opposition day and the ceasefire vote. Obviously, as a government whip, you spend a lot of time on the floor of the House. Could you give us a general description, perhaps for listeners? It was, a lot went on as to what sort of happened, what the processes normally are.
So the main opposition party, Labour, have allocated a certain number of opposition day debates. The SNP, I think, are allocated a lot fewer, but still have some. And the SNP decided to debate on Gaza in Israel, and their motion was to demand an immediate ceasefire. Now, there's Standing Order 31, which I've now learnt what it is off the back of last Wednesday, is the procedure that the House uses it's the procedures that are used for opposition day debates. By convention, what would normally happen is the SNP would put forward their motion. The government, if it decided to, would put forward their own motion and amendments, both adding to and deleting, and the official opposition Labour Party could do the same. What I would have expected, I was in chamber when Mr. Speaker made the decision, would have been for the SNP to put forward their motion, the government to amend, and then Labour.
So Labour to come last? Labour
to come last. But if the substantive with the government motion was passed, Labour would not get the opportunity to vote on their motion.
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, in his wisdom, decided to level the playing field in his eyes, which was a break with convention, and you had the Chief Clerk write advice confirming that was not his view, that actually he would allow the Labour Party's amendment to be higher in the pecking order.
And before the SNP?
Before the SNP. So what would actually have happened was the SNP would not have been able to vote for their own motion, which is why Stephen Flynn and the SNP in Westminster were really upset, because effectively you had the Labour Party hijack the SNP opposition day debate. I think there are still ongoing repercussions about whether the leader of the opposition and or others within the Labour Party put undue pressure on Mr. Speaker. My personal interaction with Lindsay is that he's always been an honourable man. I do think he probably regrets his decisions from that last week. There is something called an early day motion, EDM, which is currently gaining signatures. I think the last count is over 90. By convention, government ministers and whips do not sign the EDM. So if you think the 650 MPs and the EDM states that the title is "We've lost confidence in the Speaker," when you're talking about 90 colleagues cross-party, so the SNP are the main drivers, but you've got Conservative backbenchers, and you've had Plaid Cymru, and numbers that continue to be added every day, that does not bode well for Mr. Speaker. And my worry is that he will be unfortunate collateral damage for what I think the Labour Party put him under undue pressure. While I definitely don't normally talk about MP security measures, I know being a Member of Parliament today is a lot less safe than when I first got elected. And I know that when I speak to colleagues and some of the horror stories that some of my colleagues, especially female colleagues up and down the country, have to combat, not just the inbox and social media, but also death threats and other threats to their loved ones. That's a real threat to democracy. So while the sentiment of defending parliamentarians is correct, I do think that we've had opposition day debates historically where the Conservative MPs were the ones getting threats, and the decision was still to maintain convention. I think the real challenge Mr. Speaker has is why a Labour MP safety is more of a priority than SNP, Plaid Cymru, Lib Dems or even Conservatives. So it's an ongoing debate, and if and when it's debated, it'll be interesting to hear other colleagues' views.
Yeah. And on a slightly lighter note, to sort of end the... obviously, we've been talking about some heavier subjects there. Got a few personal quick-fire questions.
Sure.
So what country would you like to visit next, either as part of the job or on holiday? Is there a particular one you've got in mind?
So while I'm relatively well travelled, there's a lot of part of the world I've not seen. I've never been to South America, never done Australia, New Zealand. There's countries in Europe that I've not done. There's a lot of Africa. One of the benefits of being a member of Parliament is that actually my role is not just as a UK parliamentarian, but an international politician. Because the world we live in today, what happens across the world, directly impacts our safety and security in the UK. So getting better knowledge and actually the soft politics of having relationships around the world will become increasingly more important in my eyes. So as a government whip, I don't travel beyond the Armed Forces scheme that I recently spoke about, because I'm regarded as Minister of the Crown. So yes. I'm not allowed to go on official delegations that I did do historically, because it may have confused the host nation about was I speaking on behalf of HMG or not. Let's see. In some ways, and this is my journey today in politics, I don't know what the opportunity is, but I'm trying to keep my eyes open for the opportunity that if it is offered, it's a yes or no, take it and see how it goes. And that philosophy, I don't think it's harmed my political career to date, and actually I'm a lot more knowledgeable when I've done those type of delegations than I was without doing.
Yeah, so they're very useful, I mean, clearly.
Even if it's just better interaction with some of my colleagues cross-party, where you take us outside the Westminster bubble, you see us on the human side, but also what drives us in politics. So some of my best political friends are opposition MPs, and some of my worst political enemies are ones sitting on my benches, because typically it's policy related. And as I've said in previous podcasts, and Gabriel, you would have heard this multiple times, politics is team sport, and the real challenge is trying to figure out which person's on your team, and how you can drive and utilise that going forward.
Yeah, and so out of I've selected 3 movie trilogies here. I think the 3 probably most famous ones: so Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and The Godfather. You can only have one for the rest of your life, to watch. What are you choosing there?
God, that's a really tough one.
So Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, or The Godfather. I'm sure many listeners have watched all of these many times.
I've watched all of them many times, and I would probably go Star Wars. And the reason I say that is when I was growing up, you had terrestrial TV and nothing else. So you would always have one of the Star Wars episodes coming on at Christmas, and we'd all camp around the TV, ideally with fresh popcorn and drinks just to watch it. So Godfather was very heavy and a great trilogy. Lord of the Rings was one thing that when I was at school, I listened to as an audiobook.
Oh, the original Tolkien.
The original Tolkien. And I don't do horrors. And I still remember sticking my head under the duvet when certain scary bits turned up. So I was probably a bit too young to be listening to it at the time, but I've got fond memories of all 3 trilogies.
Yeah, no, so do I. I'm glad I'm not having to answer that question. And finally, to sort of round it off, after a long day in Westminster, or just a long day, out and about in constituency, do you have a comfort meal, something, a home-cooked meal from your childhood, or something that really is your...
So I burn toast is my cooking skill. So
not a chef.
No. Well, yes and no. I've learned that actually I can cook if I choose to. So I'm always very grateful when someone provides me food, and I'm not a fussy eater. I'll eat pretty much anything, and just having the option of someone putting food in front of me and eating it is more than satisfying. In terms of palate, something like Italian. I don't do spicy food, so while I'm Indian by heritage, everyone says, "Oh, do you like a curry?" I'm a korma type of person, so it really is one of the few foods that I wouldn't naturally go towards. Whereas I like sushi, good steak, and I'm not fussy.
Hard to go wrong with a good steak, isn't it? Yeah. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to sit down, Gagan. I think this has been great. And till next time, listeners, on Radio Gagan.
Thank you, Gabriel.